Wade. Welcome to Wade's World. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this video and press the notification bell at the end of the video. In the light of it being Heritage Day yesterday in South Africa, that's the 24th of September, I thought I'd speak about the 10 perhaps interesting or little known truths or facts about South Africa. Okay.
So tell us about Jan van Riebeeck.
According to our history, which is for the most part straight in 1652, Jan van Riebeeck landed at the Cape, right, with 3 ships. But perhaps what is not so well known is the organization he worked for. He worked for a company called the Dutch East India Company, which is probably the world's first multinational global company listed on the most efficient and probably the first modern day or modern era stock exchange in the Netherlands. This organization was so big, it employed in excess of 150,000 people worldwide, could negotiate its own contracts. Now just think about that for a moment. Acted on behalf of the government of the Netherlands, traded globally, right, and boasted its own army and naval fleet. Right? In today's terms, adjusted for inflation, the VOC or the Verenigde Oosterlandse Compagnie or Dutch East India Company would probably be worth anything in the order of $7.8 to $7.9 trillion. Now, to put this in perspective for you, this is several times bigger from a capitalization perspective than the most valuable company on the planet, Apple.
So tell us why the Portuguese is important to South Africa.
Okay, the reason why the Portuguese are important to South Africa is because the Portuguese, through Dias and Gama, arrived easy in the order of just under 150 years before Jan van Riebeeck arrived here. They were perhaps the most prolific early seafarers, and they more than likely had perhaps not the largest, but one of the most efficient navies. Under a guy by the name of Prince Henry, who's otherwise known as Prince Henry, right, the navigator. They were prolific in that regard. Some of two of the interesting things that people don't know about the Portuguese is that they introduced a type of maize seed or grain into South Africa. So in other words, right, the 2 types that we have, right, is one is credited to the Portuguese. The other is that the Portuguese also introduced guns and ammunition into South Africa and traded with both the Khoi and the Nguni tribes along the east coast for years and years before Jan van Riebeeck landed in the Cape. Because in South African history, or from an apartheid perspective, it's as if South Africa only started in 1652. That is not true. South Africa, right, has always been there. That of course has never been called South Africa. That is a white European social construct. But white people traded with the Nguni tribes and the Khoi and Korana for more than 100 years before Van Riebeeck landed at the Cape.
Talk to us a bit about 1685 and the French Huguenots.
Okay, right. 1685 in France was a very important era. There was probably about in the order of just over 1 million Protestants. France right today is very much a Catholic country, and it was a Catholic country back then. Under King Louis XVI, right, they had right, he proclaimed the Edict of Nantes, which is that he allowed the Protestants, which we would understand to be the French Huguenots, right, to practice their religion freely and bear arms. Right. In 1685, right, the Edict of Fontainebleau, otherwise known as the Edict of Nantes, right, revoked those privileges, and they became a persecuted minority. In fact, they were so badly persecuted that it has been estimated that out of a population of roughly 900,000, they were reduced to as many as only a few thousand. And of course, they fled all over Europe, to other parts of Europe, including Denmark, England, Belgium, and the Americas. But importantly for us, right, they also came to South Africa. Now, how they came to South Africa is that the VOC offered them free passage to South Africa, loans for their homes, land, seed, and farming equipment, and amazingly, cash flow, for 5 years, so that they could work their farms in any area in the Western Cape. And of course, they chose Stellenbosch and the Paarl area because it wasn't as windy, and therefore we have the vineyards and wine heritage.
In Dutch, Afrikaner means from Africa. Will you just elaborate a bit more on that for us?
Yeah, see, one of the ironies of South African history, which is largely white supremacist history, and I know white people may not want to hear this, but it is the truth. Any half-decent historian right, will tell you that it's constructed along the line of how whites viewed it. So just think of it for a moment. There are 4.5 million white people in South Africa. This is the largest expatriate white community outside of the Americas, Oceania, and Europe. There isn't a bigger community of white people that consider themselves South Africans, or Africans for that matter, right? Quite apart from the fact that South Africa is known for the world's most perfect system of racism, otherwise known as apartheid, right? The irony of all of this is that the word Afrikaner is actually Dutch for African. How strange is that, right? Yet strangely, see, the Afrikaner exists almost in a parallel world or a duality where he sees himself as African, but not as black African. So arguably, it's quite reasonable to refer to them as the white tribe of Africa, which you'll get in if you read David Addison's book, The BBC Journalist of 1972.
Talk to us a bit about the Anglo-Boer War.
Yes, right. There were two Anglo-Boer wars. I think right, the second Anglo-Boer War, firstly, all wars are about two things, land and resources. There is no other reason. People don't fight because they hate each other. They fight because I have or you have what I wish for and I want. And so we fight. So arguably from an historical point of view, and again, you're welcome to look at any war historian or any well-known historian. Right, Kilbertson would be one, Howard Zinn and Michael Parenti would be another. Wars are about resources. So post the cessation of hostilities in the Anglo-Boer War, end of 1902, 03, Kitchener and Milner meets with the Boer generals like Rat de la Rey and Louis Botha and Christian de Wet in otherwise known as the Treaty of Vereniging. Even though, incidentally, it didn't happen in Vereniging. Goodness knows why it's called that. It actually happened in a suburb just outside of Pretoria. They negotiated, and after, I think it's perhaps about 2 or 3 months, they came to the conclusion that the British were quite happy to offer the Afrikaner 3 million rand, 3 million pounds rather, in war reparations. Turns out that they didn't receive 3 million pounds in war reparations, as some of the history books will tell you, but in fact they received at the end 16 million pounds in war reparations. So efficient was Kitchener, that Kitchener was able to organize them stock, farming equipment, feeds to rehabilitate and revitalize their farms, and 16 million pounds in war reparations. To put that in perspective for you, adjusted for inflation again, and in today's terms, you're probably talking in the order of just over under 9 billion rands. Now that is a massive financial boost for an ethnic group that small. Now, of course, they deny this, but I mean, you can't deny history. Just like you can't deny the day you were born or the mother that you come from. It's irrefutable, unfortunately.
Explain the Battle of Blood River to us.
Okay, Afrikaner hegemony is centered around the mythology of the Battle of Blood River. We're led to believe that a ragtag bunch of really tough Afrikaner commandos, I don't know why they would call themselves commandos, because there's no instance in South African history of the Afrikaner receiving training from the British, who were the enemy, who of course wouldn't train them. So goodness knows they, perhaps that's to lionize themselves. The Battle of Blood River, for all intents and purposes, didn't happen. It is unlikely that a few dozen men would have defeated 30,000 trained Zulu warriors. For the simple reason that it took the British Empire, perhaps, in fact not perhaps, the most powerful army at the time, 40 years in 1879 to finally defeat the Zulu army. And that was not before they received a crushing blow right at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. So in other words, right, here's the Zulus that are able to defeat the British, the most powerful army, much like America is today, the most powerful army in the world at the time, and they were able to defeat the British, right, but they weren't able to defeat a few right, Afrikaner with a couple of dozen wagons and a few, right, a couple of cannons, I believe, and then a few guns. That's highly improbable. So they pitch the history, especially the fulcrum of the history, which is the Battle of Blood River, as the focus of the history in respect of them having made a covenant with God. Arguably, you can say at that point that they viewed themselves as the new Israelis in the land, right amongst the Philistines, which of course were black people. There's no independent proof or evidences of the Zulus being defeated at the Battle of Blood River. For that matter, the Afrikaner had a history of fighting with the Nguni tribes all the time, and oftentimes enlisting the British to help them defeat the Nguni tribes. Okay, so unfortunately there isn't any evidence to prove that, other than that, if you repeat a myth often enough, it eventually becomes the truth.
Talk to us about 1920 and what's significant about that for the Afrikaners.
Okay, well, it's actually both 1920 and 1930, right? In 1918, right, a group of very clever guys and patriots came together and started De Jong Zuid-Afrika. 2 years later, it morphed into the Broederbond. Now, the Broederbond was unlike any other organization in South Africa. These guys was a clique of influential Afrikaners that sought to look after their culture, sought to maintain and look after their culture, their language, their tradition, the Afrikaner identity, right? And very, very specifically Afrikaner hegemony. They used white supremacy right, or racism as a means to achieve that hegemony. In a sense, the Broederbond can be likened to the mafia, the Sicilian mafia, La Cosa Nostra. So this is an organization, a shadowy, hidden, secretive organization that runs things from behind the scenes. Perhaps the world's first example of what we know today as a deep state. Oftentimes we refer to the deep state with regards to America when we talk about the billionaire oligarchs and the military-industrial congressional complex running and paying off the Democrats and the Republicans. So no doubt that is the first example of a deep state and a shadowy mafia-type organization. Now, of course, I can imagine it would probably sound very egregious to Afrikaners, but right, if you compare it pound for pound and like for like, and the intentions, it is exactly the same. It was really all about hegemony for power and resources. That is it. I beg your pardon.
What is the link between the Broederbond and banks?
Okay. The Broederbond was so efficient. See that one of the reasons, 1948 was a very significant year for the Afrikaner, in that they managed to win the general election by a very slim majority. But now, see, unfortunately, these things aren't taught in our normal history books. This is what happens, right? You win an election, you're in control of a few things. So I'm going to spell it out for you, right? You're in control of the lawmaking processes. Parliament only exists, or Congress in America only exists to enact laws. You can promulgate and enact those laws however you wish. And so they together with the previous laws like the 1913 Lands Act, they put together a body of laws, statutes and ordinances in the order of 2,000. And again, perhaps the most complete set of racist laws the world has ever known. Right? But then importantly, it gave them access to two things. The central bank, which they could appoint a governor to, and print money and therefore create banks. And so the Broederbond is credited with helping to create Volkskas, but certainly Trust Bank. Trust Bank acted as an easy lender to any Afrikaner that had an Afrikaans surname like Van der Merwe or Viljoen. You could walk in there, get very, very cheap rates, otherwise known as soft loans, and almost loans quite apart from, or not related to his income. In other words, they looked at them very, very magnanimously, very, very decently. Right? So an Afrikaner could walk and get a loan and walk out. It was as easy as that. It was the Broederbond that came up with the idea of creating banks, and Trust Bank is one of them. In total, they put together, so both the Nationalist Party and the Broederbond, leading from behind, created in the order of anything between 8 and 10 banks. That those banks in 1991 merged and became Amalgamated Banks of South Africa, otherwise known as ABSA, a multinational banking conglomerate worth in the order of, I'm going to say it again, a few $1 billion US. Okay, so see, from those small beginnings, that is the power that you have once you win an election. So you win an election, you can enact any laws you want, and you control the central bank. The central bank, in simple terms, can be viewed as the mother bank, and as therefore it acts as the lender of last resort to any of the existing banks or any banks that you create.
Last but not least, will you just take us through the goal of apartheid?
Okay. I think that is perhaps most people that look like me and black people get it wrong. They think the goal of apartheid was racism and white supremacy. Not so. Right? White supremacy and racism was used to achieve perhaps the greatest single acts of state-sponsored larceny and theft the world has ever known. Now, of course, there was bigger acts of larceny after that. Let me give you an example. Post 1990, 1991, it's estimated by even the most conservative economists that in order of 3 trillion rand was shipped offshore by South African corporates and high net worth individuals and wealthy individuals. So this in essence is all about money, power that begets money, and the other way around. It exists and enjoys a symbiotic relationship. So let me restate that again. White supremacy was used as the ideology to justify theft. All dominant cultures right throughout history have always used an ideology. Today, neo-capitalists use neoliberalism as their ideology. Back then, the white Afrikaner used white supremacy and racism as their ideology, which acted as the gateway for the hegemonic control of land, mineral resources, and the wealth of the country. Ultimately, folks, it boils down to this very, very simple thing. It is about theft. Thank you very, very much for joining me. I know it was short. Next week I'll be talking about the invention of the Afrikaner as a white ethnic group in Africa, and why it is important that we understand Afrikaner history, not as how they speak about the history and mythologize the history, but how the actual history, because these things are easily confirmable. And I'm quite happy to provide credits and acknowledgements at the end of my video next week so that you can look it up and do some research yourself. Please like and subscribe to this video. Remember, this is Wade's World. So join me next week, same time, same place. Have a good one.